Jake Martinez walked through the massive doors of the Galactic Engineering Academy on planet Nexus Prime and felt very small. The building was huge and made of some kind of blue crystal that seemed to glow from inside. Students from all over the galaxy moved through the halls, and Jake had never seen so many different kinds of beings in one place before. He was the only human at the academy and had been there for 6 months now. At first, the other students stared at him a lot because humans were new to the galactic community. Most of them had never seen a human before. Jake tried to be friendly, but it was hard when some students were made of rock and others were just floating balls of light. The classroom where Jake had his survival engineering class was enormous. The ceiling was so high he could not see the top, and the walls curved in strange ways that hurt his eyes if he looked too long. Professor Zixtara was already at the front of the room when Jake walked in. She was tall and looked like she was made of clear crystal with light moving around inside her body. Her voice came from a small device that floated near her head. Because she did not have a mouth like humans did, Jake sat in his usual spot near the back of the room. Next to him sat Lisa Park, who was from a planet called Harmony 7. She looked almost human, except her skin was blue and she had 4 arms. Lisa was one of the few students who talked to Jake regularly, and they had become friends over the past few months. The other students filled the room quickly. There were Aquarians who lived in water suits that covered their whole bodies. Their suits made bubbling sounds when they moved. The Rocklings were students made of different kinds of stone and metal. They moved very slowly and made scraping sounds when they walked. The Lumina students were balls of pure energy that floated in the air and spoke through light patterns that the translation devices changed into words. Professor Zixtara raised one of her crystal arms and the room became quiet. Her voice came through the floating device in a tone that sounded like wind chimes. Students, today I will give you the details of your final examination for this semester. Jake leaned forward in his seat. He had been wondering what the final test would be like. The other tests in the class had been mostly written work about different survival techniques used by various alien species. This was his first practical test, and he was both excited and nervous. You will be taken to the planet Krin 7, Professor Zixtara continued. This planet has some of the most difficult conditions in our galaxy. The temperature stays at minus 200 degrees, which is cold enough to freeze most forms of life instantly. The wind blows at speeds that can knock down buildings. The atmosphere is mostly poison gas that will kill you in seconds without protection. Several students made worried sounds. The Aquarians started bubbling faster in their suits. Some of the Rocklings shifted nervously and made grinding noises. Even the Lumina students flickered in ways that Jake had learned meant they were upset. Each of you will be given the same basic supplies, the professor said. You will have metal pieces to build a frame. You will have sheets of insulation material. You will have 3 energy cells for power. You will have 1 fabrication tool that can shape and join materials. You will have 72 standard hours to build a shelter that can keep 1 person alive. Jake thought about this carefully. 72 hours was 3 days. The conditions sounded terrible but not impossible. He had read about places on Earth that were almost as cold and dangerous. Humans had lived in those places for thousands of years before they had advanced technology. The shelter must protect you from the cold and wind, Professor Zixtara explained. It must have a power source that will last at least 1 week. It must have air recycling systems to keep the atmosphere breathable. Most importantly, it must be built by you alone with no help from others. Lisa Park raised one of her 4 hands. Professor, what happens if our shelter fails during the test? Emergency beacons will transport you to safety, the professor replied. But you will fail the class and must repeat the entire semester. Jake noticed that most of his classmates looked very worried now. The Aquarians were bubbling so fast their suits were shaking. The Rocklings had stopped moving completely, which Jake knew meant they were thinking very hard. The Lumina students were flickering in rapid patterns, but Jake felt something different. He was not scared or worried. Instead, he felt excited. This test sounded like a real challenge, and Jake loved challenges. He started thinking about all the ways he could approach the problem. most of his classmates were probably thinking about building the smallest shelter possible that would just barely meet the requirements. Jake was thinking about something completely different. He was thinking about how humans had survived in harsh places on Earth. They did not just build shelters to barely survive. They built communities that could grow and thrive even in the worst conditions. They worked together and shared resources and knowledge. Professor, Jake raised his hand. Are we allowed to communicate with other students during the test? The crystal being flickered and the translation device made? Sounds like breaking glass, which Jake had learned meant she was thinking. The rules state that each student must build their own shelter without direct physical assistance. Communication is not specifically forbidden. Several students turned to look at Jake with curiosity. Most of them probably wondered why he would want to talk to others during a survival test. In their cultures, competition meant working alone and keeping secrets from others, but Jake was human, and humans had learned long ago that cooperation was often better than competition. He started forming a plan in his mind that was very different from what the professor expected. He was not just going to build a shelter. He was going to build something much better. The class ended and students began filing out of the room. Lisa Park walked beside Jake as they left. "Why did you ask about communication?" she said. "Are you planning to cheat somehow?" Jake smiled. "I am not planning to cheat. I am planning to win. But not the way everyone else thinks about winning." Lisa looked confused, but she did not ask more questions. Jake spent the rest of the day thinking about his plan. He went to the Academy library and read everything he could find about Krin 7. He studied the weather patterns and the landscape. He learned about the materials they would be given and how they could be used. That night, Jake lay in his small dormitory room and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, they would be transported to one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy. His classmates were probably scared and worried about just surviving. But Jake was excited because he was not planning to just survive. He was planning to show the galaxy what humans could really do when they put their minds to something. The transport ship that took them to Krin 7 was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. It was shaped like a giant teardrop and made of the same glowing crystal as the Academy buildings. Inside there were no seats or floors like human ships would have. Instead, there were floating platforms that adjusted to fit each different type of student. Jake stood on his platform and watched through the clear walls as they approached Krin 7. The planet looked like a giant ball of white and gray ice with massive storms swirling across its surface. Lightning flashed constantly through the clouds, and Jake could see that the storms covered the entire planet with no clear areas. Anywhere Professor Zixthara floated near the front of the ship on her own crystal platform. Her voice came through the translation devices that all students wore. "Students, you will be dropped in different locations across the northern continent. Each drop zone is exactly 50 kilometers from the others. You will not be able to see or reach each other easily." The Aquarian students were bubbling nervously in their water suits. Jake could see they were scared, and he did not blame them. Even through the ship's protective barriers, he could feel how cold and hostile the planet was. The temperature readings on the wall displays showed -190 degrees. And they were still in space above the planet. "Remember," Professor Zixthara continued, "you have 72 hours to complete your shelters. The drop pods will return to collect you at exactly that time, whether your shelters are finished or not. If your shelter fails before then, activate your emergency beacon, and you will be rescued, but you will fail the examination." Jake checked his equipment one more time. He had the same supplies as everyone else packed in a small container that would drop with him. Metal framework pieces that could be joined together. Insulation sheets that would keep heat inside. 3 energy cells that could power basic systems. 1 fabrication tool that could cut and shape and weld materials together. But Jake also had something the other students did not have. He had studied the drop zone maps that were posted in the ship's information area. Most students had looked at their own zones, but Jake had memorized all of them. He knew exactly where each of his classmates would be landing, and he had a plan. The drop began, and Jake felt his stomach lurch as his pod separated from the main ship. Through the small window, he watched the planet get bigger and bigger below him. The storms looked even more frightening up close, with winds that moved faster than hurricanes on Earth. Ice crystals as big as houses flew through the air. Like deadly missiles, Jake's pod hit the ground hard and slid across ice for several hundred meters before stopping. When the pod door opened, the cold hit him like a physical blow, even through his environmental suit. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked him over, and the sound was like standing inside a tornado. He grabbed his supply container and activated his suit's navigation system. According to his readings, he was in Sector 7, exactly where he was supposed to be. The landscape around him was nothing but ice and rock formations that looked like frozen waves. The sky was dark, even though it was supposed to be daytime, because the storms blocked out the sun completely. Most students would start building their shelters immediately. The cold was so intense that every minute outside meant using more of their suit's power to stay warm, but Jake had a different plan. He activated his communication system and began broadcasting on all available frequencies. "This is Jake Martinez in Sector 7 calling all students," he said into his suit's microphone. "I have a proposal that could help all of us succeed in this test. Anyone interested in hearing what I have to say, please respond." At first, there was only static and wind noise. Jake was not surprised, because most alien species were taught that survival tests were individual challenges where helping others was considered cheating. But Jake knew that human survival had always been about working together, especially in the most dangerous situations. After several minutes, he heard a familiar voice through the static. "Jake, this is Lisa Park in Sector 12. What kind of proposal are you talking about?" Jake smiled inside his helmet. He had hoped Lisa would be the first to respond because they were already friends and she trusted him. "Lisa, I am not suggesting we cheat. I am suggesting we think about this problem differently than the professor expects." More voices began coming through the communication system. Carlos Washington from Sector 3 sounded curious. Amy Chen from Sector 15 asked what Jake had in mind. Even some of the alien students began responding, including a rockling named Stonebreaker and an Aquarian called Bubbleflow. "Listen, everyone," Jake said as more students joined the communication network. "We are all trying to solve the same problem, which is surviving in this terrible place for 3 days. But what if instead of building 30 separate shelters that might fail, we built something better?" "What do you mean, better?" asked Stone Breaker in his slow, grinding voice. Jake had been thinking about this since the class ended yesterday. "What if we built one large community instead of many small shelters? What if we combined all our materials and knowledge and skills to create something that is not just surviving but actually thriving?" There was silence on the communication network. For several long moments, Jake could almost hear his classmates thinking about this idea. It was so different from everything they had been taught about individual achievement and competition. "But the professor said we must build our own shelters," said Bubbleflow through the bubbling sounds of his water suit. "The professor said we must build shelters that can keep us alive," Jake replied. "She did not say they had to be separate or that we could not help each other as long as everyone builds something. What I'm proposing is that everyone builds part of one big shelter instead of complete small shelters." Amy Chun was the next to speak. "Where would we build this community shelter?" "We are spread across 50 kilometers. Jake had already thought about this too. During his study of the drop zone maps, he had identified a location that would work perfectly. There is a natural valley between Sectors 9 and 10 that has rock formations on 3 sides. It would provide protection from the worst winds, and we could build in the sheltered area." "How do you know about this valley?" asked Carlos Washington. "I studied all the maps, not just my own sector," Jake explained. "The valley is about 20 kilometers from most of our positions. It will take several hours to reach it, but once we are there, we will have much better conditions for building." More students began joining the conversation. Jake could hear the excitement in their voices as they started to understand what he was proposing. Instead of struggling alone in the deadly cold, they could work together and create something amazing. Lisa Park was the first to agree completely. "I think Jake's idea could work. My sector is very exposed to the wind and I was worried my shelter might not be strong enough. Working together sounds much better. One by one, the other students agreed to try Jake's plan. Even some who were nervous about breaking tradition decided that surviving was more important than following old customs. By the time Jake finished explaining his idea, he had over 30 students ready to travel to the valley location. Jake looked around his ice-covered sector one more time, then picked up his supply container. The storm was getting worse and the cold was becoming dangerous even with his environmental suit. But he was not worried anymore because he was not facing this challenge alone. He started walking toward the valley knowing that his classmates were doing the same thing from their own sectors. They were all heading toward the same place with the same goal. They were going to build not just shelters but a real community that could survive anything Krin 7 could throw at them. As he walked through the howling wind, Jake thought about all the times in human history when people had worked together to survive impossible situations. They had built cities in deserts and on mountains, and even in the frozen Arctic of Earth. Now he was going to show the galaxy that humans had not forgotten how to turn survival into civilization. Jake reached the valley after walking for 4 hours through the worst storm he had ever experienced. His environmental suit was working hard to keep him warm, and he could see the power levels dropping faster than he had hoped. But when he saw the valley, he knew he had made the right choice. The valley was exactly what he had hoped for from studying the maps. High rock walls on 3 sides blocked most of the wind and created a natural shelter. The ground was more level than the surrounding areas, and there were even some ice formations that could be used as building materials. Most importantly, the valley was big enough for the community he wanted to build. Lisa Park arrived about 30 minutes after Jake. She was breathing hard and her blue skin looked almost purple from the cold, but she was smiling. "Jake, this place is perfect," she said through her suit's communication system. "It is so much warmer here than where I landed." Over the next 2 hours, more students arrived at the valley. Carlos Washington came from the west, carrying his supply container and looking amazed at how much the rock walls reduced the wind. Amy Sheen arrived from the south and immediately started examining the ice formations to see how they could be used for construction. The alien students took longer to arrive because they moved differently than humans. Stonebreaker the rockling rolled into the valley, making grinding sounds that Jake had learned meant he was happy. Bubble Flow the Aquarian had the hardest time because his water suit was not designed for long-distance travel on land, but he made it with help from other students. By the time 32 students had gathered in the valley, Jake was ready to begin organizing the construction. The first, he had to explain his plan in detail because most of his classmates had never seen anything like what he wanted to build. "Everyone gather around," Jake called out over the wind, which was much quieter in the valley but still loud. "I want to show you what we are going to build here." Jake used his fabrication tool to draw lines in the ice, showing the layout of his planned community. "We are not going to build separate shelters scattered around the valley," he explained. "We are going to build one connected village with different areas for different purposes." He drew a large circle in the center of his ice drawing. "This will be our community center where we can all gather. It will have the main power systems and air recycling equipment. It will be warm and comfortable for everyone." Then he drew smaller circles connected to the main one with lines. "These will be living modules where small groups can sleep and have privacy. Each module will be connected to the community center by covered walkways so no one has to go outside in the storm." Lisa Park studied the drawing with her 4 arms crossed. "Jake, this looks much more complicated than building simple shelters. Are you sure we can finish it in 72 hours? Jake smiled at her concern. "Lisa, that is the beauty of working together. When 30 people work on one project, it gets done much faster than when 30 people work on 30 different projects. But we have to be organized and efficient." Jake began assigning tasks based on what each species could do best. The rocklings, like Stonebreaker, were natural builders who could shape and move heavy materials. He put them in charge of creating the foundation and main structural supports for all the buildings. The Lumina students were beings of pure energy who could work with electrical systems better than anyone else. Jake assigned them to design and install the power grid that would connect all the buildings and distribute energy from their combined energy cells. The Aquarians had experience with air and water systems because they lived in controlled environments on their home planets. Jake put them in charge of the air recycling and atmosphere control systems that would keep everyone breathing safely. The multi-armed species like Lisa Park and several others were perfect for assembly work that required handling many parts at once. Jake assigned them to work on the fabrication and joining of structural elements. Jake kept the human students, including himself and Amy, June, and Carlos Washington, in coordination roles. They would move between work groups, making sure everything fit together properly and solving problems as they came up. But Jake, said Bubble, Flo through his suit's bubbling translator, what about the individual shelter requirement? The professor said we each had to build our own shelter. Jake had been expecting this question. Everyone will build their own living module, he explained. You will design it and construct it yourself using your own materials and tools. But instead of building it alone in the storm, you will build it here in the valley connected to our community systems. This satisfied most of the students' concerns about following the test requirements. They would still be building individual shelters, but in a much smarter way that gave everyone a better chance of success. The work began immediately because they had already lost several hours traveling to the valley. Jake watched as his classmates organized themselves into work groups and started on their assigned tasks. It was amazing to see so many different species working together toward the same goalstone breaker, and the other rocklings began moving large chunks of ice and shaping them into foundation blocks. Their natural ability to manipulate stone and mineral materials made them incredibly efficient at this work. They could shape ice formations in minutes that would have taken other students hours to cut, and move the Lumina students floated above the work area planning the electrical systems. Jake watched them communicate with each other through light patterns that were too fast for the translation devices to follow. They were clearly excited about designing something more complex than the simple power systems required for basic shelters. The Aquarians worked on atmospheric systems using techniques from their underwater cities. They understood airflow and pressure systems better than any of the other species because they had to maintain perfect environmental balance in their water habitats. Jake moved between the work groups, coordinating activities and solving problems. When the Rocklings needed to know where to place foundation supports, he consulted with the Lumina students about power cable routing. When the Aquarians needed to know about airflow patterns, he worked with everyone to plan the layout of connecting tunnels. Amy Chun was working with a group of students on fabricating wall panels and insulation systems. Her engineering training helped her optimize the designs for maximum efficiency with their limited materials. Carlos Washington coordinated the supply distribution, making sure every work group had the materials they needed when they needed them. As the work progressed, Jake started to see his vision becoming reality. The foundation of the community center took shape as a large circular structure with connection points for the smaller living modules. The power systems began forming a grid that would supply energy more efficiently than individual generators, but the most amazing thing was watching his classmates discover new ways to work together. Species that had never cooperated before found that their different abilities complemented each other perfectly. The Rocklings could create structures that the Lumina students could power, and the Aquarians could ventilate. After 12 hours of continuous work, they had accomplished more than Jake had dared to hope. The community center was nearly complete, with a functioning power grid and environmental systems. Several of the individual living modules were already connected and operational. Jake stood in the center of their growing village and looked around at what they had accomplished. His classmates were tired but excited as they saw their individual efforts combining into something greater than any of them could have built alone. Jake, Lisa Park called out from where she was working on her personal living module, I never thought building a shelter could be this much fun. This feels more like building a real home than just surviving a test. Jake nodded as he watched the wind and snow raging outside their sheltered valley while inside their village warm. Light glowed from multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. They were not just surviving the test anymore. They were proving that cooperation could turn the most difficult challenges into opportunities for building something amazing. By the 18th hour of the test, Jake's village had grown beyond anything he had originally imagined. What started as a simple plan to build connected shelters had become a complex community with specialized areas and advanced systems that impressed even Jake himself. The community center was now a large, warm space where students could gather to eat and rest and plan their work. The Lumina students had installed beautiful lighting systems that provided not just illumination but also heat and even some entertainment through shifting color patterns. The Aquarians had created an atmosphere control system so advanced that the air inside was actually cleaner and more comfortable than the air in their environmental suits. Jake walked through the covered walkways that connected all the buildings and marveled at what his classmates had accomplished. The walkways themselves had become works of art as different species added their own cultural touches to the basic designs. The Rucklings had carved decorative patterns into the ice walls. The energy beings had added flowing light displays that moved along the ceiling like rivers of stars. Amy Chun met Jake at the entrance to the new workshop area that had been built during the night shift. "Jake, you need to see what Carlos has been working on," she said with excitement in her voice. He figured out how to modify the fabrication tools to work together as one big manufacturing system. Jake followed Amy into the workshop where Carlos Washington was coordinating a team of students operating multiple fabrication tools in perfect synchronization. They were producing building components faster and with better quality than anyone had thought possible with their basic equipment. "Carlos, this is incredible," Jake said as he watched structural panels being shaped and joined in an automated sequence. "How did you figure out how to network the tools together?" Carlos grinned as he monitored the production process. "I remembered something from my engineering classes about distributed manufacturing. Each fabrication tool has communication capabilities that are supposed to be used for downloading new programs. But I realized we could use those same communication links to coordinate the tools into one big factory system." The workshop was producing not just basic shelter components, but also furniture and equipment, and even decorative items that made the village feel more like a real home. Jake watched students from different species working together to design and build things that none of them could have created. Alone Lisa Park appeared at Jake's shoulder carrying a datapad that showed the village's power consumption and production statistics. "Jake, we have a problem, but it is a good problem," she said. "Our power systems are so efficient that we are generating more energy than we are using. The Lumina students want to know if we can build additional facilities." Jake looked at the data and saw that their combined energy cells and the solar collectors that the Lumina students had built were indeed producing excess power. "What kind of additional facilities are they thinking about?" "Stonebreaker suggested we build a greenhouse where we could grow food using some seeds that Bubbleflow brought from his home planet," Lisa explained. "The Aquarians think they can create a water recycling system that would give us fresh water for cooking and cleaning." Jake felt a surge of excitement as he realized what his classmates were suggesting. They were not just building shelters to survive the test anymore. They were building infrastructure for a permanent settlement that could support life on this hostile planet indefinitely. "Let them build whatever they want," Jake said. "As long as everyone completes their individual living modules, we are meeting the test requirements. Everything else we build just shows how much we can accomplish when we work together." Jake continued his tour of the village and found new improvements everywhere he looked. The individual living modules that each student was required to build had become showcases of different architectural styles and cultural preferences, but they were all connected to the central systems and designed to work together as parts of the larger community. Stonebreaker had carved his living module directly into the rock wall of the valley, creating a cave-like space that was perfectly suited to his mineral-based biology. But he had also installed connection ports and communication links that integrated his module fully with the rest of the village. Bubbleflow had created a living module that was partially filled with water from the recycling systems, allowing him to be more comfortable than he could ever be in just his environmental suit. But his module also served as part of the village's water treatment facility, benefiting everyone. The energy-based Lumina. Students had built living modules that were more like art installations than traditional shelters. Their spaces were filled with complex light patterns and electromagnetic fields that were beautiful to observe. But they also served as part of the village's communication network, allowing instant contact between all residents. Jake realized that his human classmates had also learned from the alien approaches to construction and design. Amy Chun had incorporated rockling mineral shaping techniques into her module's walls. Carlos Washington had adopted Aquarian environmental control methods for his air circulation systems as Jake walked through his own living module, which he had built using ideas borrowed from all his classmates. He felt proud of what they had accomplished together. His module was comfortable and efficient, but it was also connected to the community in ways that made him feel part of something larger than himself. The storm outside continued to rage with winds that would have destroyed any individual shelter built in the open. But inside the valley, their village was warm and bright and full of the sounds of students working and talking and laughing. Together, Jake checked the time remaining on his environmental suit's display and saw that they still had over 50 hours left before the pickup ships would arrive. At their current rate of progress, he estimated they could build enough facilities to support a community of 100 people, or more. Jake called out a voice from the communication system that now connected all parts of the village. It was Professor Zixthara, and she sounded confused and maybe a little concerned. Student Martinez, please respond immediately. Jake activated his communication unit, wondering why the professor was calling before the test period was over. This is Jake Martinez, Professor. Is there a problem with the test? Student Martinez, I am receiving monitoring data from Krin 7 that does not match what I expected, the professor said. My instruments are detecting energy signatures and structural formations that seem far too advanced for basic survival shelters. Can you explain what is happening? Jake looked around at the thriving village that surrounded him with its connected buildings and advanced systems and happy residents from dozens of different species. He thought about how to explain to Professor Zixthara that they had not just completed her assignment but had transformed it into something completely different. Professor, we have built shelters that meet all the requirements you specified, Jake said carefully. Each student has constructed an individual shelter that can house one person and protect against the elements. All our shelters have power sources that will last more than 1 week and air recycling systems that maintain breathable atmospheres, but my instruments are detecting what appears to be a small city, Professor Zixthara replied. How is this possible with the limited supplies you were given? Jake smiled as he prepared to give the professor an explanation that would change everything she thought she knew about survival engineering. Professor, we discovered that working together allows us to build much more than working separately. We did not just survive your test. We created something better. Professor Zixthara arrived at the valley 22 hours after the test had begun, and Jake could see immediately that she was not prepared for what she found there. Her crystal transport ship landed outside the village, and she emerged looking around in what Jake had learned to recognize as complete bewilderment. The professor's crystalline form flickered with patterns of light that her translator converted into sounds of amazement and confusion. She stood at the entrance to their community center, staring at the warm, glowing interior where students from 30 different species were gathered together, sharing food and conversation. Student Martinez, Professor Zixthara said through her floating translation device, I require an immediate explanation of what I am observing here. Jake stepped forward, flanked by Lisa Park and Carlos Washington and Amy Chun and several of his alien classmates. Behind them, the village bustled with activity as students continued working on new projects and improvements, even though their basic shelters had been completed hours ago. Professor, we have successfully completed the assignment you gave us. Jake sighed respectfully. Every student present has built an individual shelter that meets all the requirements you specified. Each shelter can house one person and protect against the extreme conditions of this planet. Each shelter has power sources that will operate for more than 1 week and atmospheric systems that maintain breathable air. Professor Zixthara moved deeper into the community center, and Jake watched her examine the advanced systems that the Lumina students had installed. The lighting was not just functional, but beautiful, with flowing patterns that responded to the movements and moods of the people in the room. The heating system maintained perfect temperature throughout the entire space while using less energy than a basic individual shelter would require. But this is far beyond the scope of a basic survival shelter, the professor said as her crystal body continued flickering with confusion. How did you achieve this level of sophistication with the limited materials provided? Amy Chun stepped forward to answer. Professor, we realized that 30 separate shelters using materials inefficiently would be much less effective than one integrated community using the same materials efficiently. By combining our resources and coordinating our efforts, we were able to build something much better than the minimum requirements. Professor Zixthara examined the power distribution system that connected all the buildings in the village. The Lumina students had designed it to be not just functional but elegant, with energy flowing through crystalline conduits that glowed softly as power moved through them. The power efficiency of this system exceeds theoretical maximums for the equipment you were given, the professor observed. How is this possible? Stonebreaker the Rockling rolled forward, making the grinding sounds that indicated he wanted to speak. Professor Human Jake taught us that many small systems working together can be more powerful than the sum of their individual capabilities. We learned to share not just materials but knowledge and skills. The professor moved to examine the atmospheric control systems that the Aquarians had built throughout the village. The air quality readings on her instruments showed levels that were actually better than the controlled environment of the transport ship. These atmospheric systems are more advanced than equipment used in permanent research stations, Professor Zixthara said. They appear to be designed not just for survival but for long-term habitation. Bubble Flow spoke through his water suit's bubbling translator. Professor, we discovered that building for survival and building for thriving use the same amount of effort if you plan correctly. Human Jake showed us that thinking bigger often makes problems easier to solve rather than harder. Jake watched as Professor Zixthara continued her examination of their village. She studied the workshop where Carlos had networked the fabrication tools into an automated manufacturing system. She observed the greenhouse where several species were growing food plants in carefully controlled soil mixtures. She examined the water recycling facility that provided fresh, clean water for cooking and cleaning and even recreation. Student Martinez, the professor finally said, I must understand how you conceived and organized this project. What you have accomplished here challenges fundamental assumptions about survival engineering that have been accepted throughout the galaxy for thousands of years. Jake thought carefully about how to explain human approaches to problem solving that might be foreign to galactic civilization. Professor, on Earth, humans learned long ago that the best way to survive difficult situations is not to endure them alone, but to work together to change them into better situations. We call this building civilization, but surely individual achievement and competition drive progress more effectively than cooperation, the professor replied. This is the foundation of educational theory throughout the galactic community. Lisa Park joined the conversation, using all four of her arms to gesture at the thriving village around them. Professor, I have learned more about engineering in the past day working with Jake and our classmates than I learned in months of individual study. When we share knowledge instead of hiding it, everyone becomes smarter. Carlos Washington pointed to the manufacturing systems he had developed. Professor, I could never have figured out how to network the fabrication tools if I had been working alone. It was only by combining my knowledge with ideas from Lumina students and Rockling students and Aquarian students that we were able to create something none of us could have built individually. Professor Zixthara spent the next several hours touring every part of the village and interviewing students about their experiences. Jake could see that she was beginning to understand that what they had accomplished was not just technically impressive, but represented a completely different philosophy of problem solving. The efficiency metrics of your community exceed the performance of individual shelters by factors I would not have believed possible, the professor admitted. Your resource utilization approaches theoretical perfection. Your redundancy systems would allow this settlement to survive catastrophic failures that would destroy traditional individual shelters. Amy Chen led the professor to the observation deck that students had built on top of the community center. From there, they could see the entire valley with its network of connected buildings and covered walkways and specialized facilities all functioning together as an integrated whole. Professor Jake taught us that humans have a saying about problems, Amy explained. They say that a problem shared is a problem halved, but a solution shared is a solution doubled. By working together, we did not just solve the shelter problem, we transformed it into an opportunity to build something amazing. As the tour concluded, Professor Zixthara stood in the center of the community center surrounded by students from dozens of different species, all of whom had contributed to creating something that none of them could have accomplished alone. Student Martinez, the professor said, what you have demonstrated here will require me to completely reconsider the curriculum of this academy. You have shown that cooperation can achieve results that competition cannot match. You have proven that survival engineering should not be about enduring harsh conditions, but about transforming them into opportunities for growth. Jake looked around at his classmates who had become not just fellow students but partners in building something unprecedented. Professor, humans have always believed that we are stronger together than apart. What we built here proves that this principle works just as well with alien species as it does with humans. Maybe the galaxy has been thinking about survival in the wrong way. The test officially ended 72 hours after it began, but none of the students wanted to leave their village. They had created not just shelters but a real community where different species could live and work and learn together. Professor Zixthara recommended that the village be maintained as a permanent research station for studying cooperative engineering techniques. Jake Martinez returned to the Galactic Engineering Academy as more than just a graduate student. He became a teacher whose methods spread throughout the galaxy, changing how alien civilizations approach survival and construction and community building. His village on Krin 7 became a symbol of what became possible when different species combined their knowledge and abilities for common goals. The human approach to turning problems into opportunities through cooperation became standard curriculum at engineering schools throughout the galaxy. Jake had proven that sometimes the best way to pass a test is not to meet the minimum requirements but to transform the entire purpose of the test into something greater than anyone had imagined possible.